Thank you very much, Stephen. It is, of course, a huge privilege for me to be back here so many years after I was a student here. The title is a clue to some of the things that I might talk about, but I've actually set myself 3 ambitions, only one of which partly relates to the issue of crime statistics. I will come to crime statistics, but my first ambition is actually to give you an insight into the world of statistics and convince you, I am an ambitious and optimistic person, convince you that statistics really matter. They matter so much that they're far too important to be left to statisticians. So my ambition is to excite and interest you in the world of statistics and convince you that how we govern statistics here, how we produce statistics, and how you can make sense of statistics is actually a fundamental part of the democratic society that we have. So that's one ambition. The second is I'll try and explain why with a couple of examples, one of which will be about crime. And then third, I will try and give you a few insights which may end up as hints and tips as to the kinds of questions that you might ask yourself when you're confronted with both, on the one hand, the range of headlines that sometimes we read when statistical information is produced, but also as citizens. You are surrounded by numbers, you're surrounded by data, you're surrounded by people quoting numbers. How on earth do you make sense of all of that? So 3 ambitions. Statistics matter, a couple of examples, and some hints and tips. I will go back to my time here because I think that gives an indication of how I got into all of this and why I think that this matters. The first thing, as Stephen said, I came here to do a sociology degree. I did not grow up wanting to be a statistician. In fact, I don't think I had a clue what being a statistician was meant, or that you could be such a thing. But I chose Sussex, I mean, for all the reasons that people in the early 70s chose Sussex, of course. But one of the reasons I chose it was because of the interdisciplinary nature of it. That was really powerful for me. I did my A-levels as way as everybody did in those days, and I did not want to choose. I did not want to have to decide between the traditional arts subjects and the science subjects and the emerging social science. We were still having a debate then, I remember, when I came here. Is it social science or is it social studies? I hope that debate doesn't happen anymore. I don't know, you can tell me. But it attracted me because, in a way, it stopped me having to choose. And one of the things that I tell young recruits, Stephen mentioned the Government Statistical Service. ONS employs something like, the Office for National Statistics, employs something like 3,500 people. The Government Statistical Service, which comprises statisticians across all Whitehall departments, there are about 1,400 professional statisticians working in the GSS. And I try and speak in groups to all the new recruits who come in to the GSS every year. From a range of backgrounds, of course, maths and stats, but a lot of social scientists of different kinds. And one of the things that I always tell them is that statistics is, of course, about numbers, and it's about maths, and it's about manipulation and understanding of data. But it's also about words, and it's also, with a small p, about politics. And I'll say a little bit more about that. It's increasingly, of course, too, about visualization of data and data science and IT as well. It's not politics in a party sense. Impartiality is one of our fundamental principles. And the fundamental principles, that's why the second part of this, I'm even wearing the same jumper to prove that that's me sitting at the front there. That's me earlier this year at the UN in New York, chairing a meeting, because I'm now chair, not vice chair, chairing a meeting of the UN Statistical Commission. The UN Statistical Commission is the people like me, the heads of statistical officers in every country that is affiliated to the UN. The point about that is that the UN, statistics is a global game, partly because what we're measuring is increasingly global, but partly because the UN, not this body, the General Assembly, the political global leaders have adopted and endorsed a set of fundamental principles for official statistics. Those fundamental principles cover 10 areas. I'm not going to read them all out, but you can see the kinds of areas which globally political leaders have endorsed as being fundamental, the names, the clues in the name, fundamental to the operation of official statistics. So just the first one, the blurb that actually goes with impartiality is official statistics should meet the test of practical utility, should be compiled and made available on an impartial basis by official statistical agencies to honour citizens' entitlements to public information. Now, that might not sound a lot. In my world, that's huge. And I can give some examples. There are lots of other kind of words like that around some of the other principles. There's one there about properly interpreted. And that says that statistical agencies are to present information according to scientific standards on the sources, methods, and procedures of those statistics. Now, a reason I draw attention to these, there is a connection with crime, and the story I'll take you through will come back to some of these principles. But my first ambition was to convince you how important this is. I know of very, very few other professional areas where the UN, as a global body at the General Assembly, has taken time, took a long time, but has taken time to consider, debate, and agree that there should be a set of global ethics, if you like. Why on earth would they do that? And it's because the statistics that we produce and every other country produces are of course, used in everyday decisions, used in resource allocation, they're used in setting interest rates, they're used in understanding demography and ageing populations. Yesterday, ONS published the latest growth estimates of GDP. Bank of England, Treasury will, of course, be poring over that to understand what's happening to the economy. Today, ONS published some new estimates of the number of zero-hours contracts. So very topical, likely to be a matter of public debate during the election, and a need for impartial, authoritative information to inform that debate. So entirely consistent with the fundamental principles and the citizens' need for public information. Of course, as soon as you do that, not only are you in the business of people making operational or policy decisions or developing policy on the basis of this kind of evidence as well as other kinds of evidence, you were also directly into the business of holding governments to account. You're into providing information that is used, because of this public nature of it, transparency, that is used for holding governments to account. In some areas, that has been a dangerous activity, not in the UK, but in some areas that has been a dangerous activity. And hence the recognition that actually trust in politicians is dependent on, in part, on having independent institutions that public can rely on in order to be able to assess the evidence on what's going on. So, fundamental principles. In the UK, we have statistical legislation. Again, there aren't that many other areas of official activity that has its own legislation. We have an Act, and that's a quote from the Act. That is what we have the objective of doing. Promoting, safeguarding, production and publication of official statistics that serve the public good. Now, again, in my world, that phrase, the public good, was something that, of course, the lawyers here will tell me it's very difficult in concept. But nevertheless, as Stephen said, I joined the civil service in 1975 and lived through what I think, in retrospect, can be seen to be quite a dark time for evidence and official statistics in the 80s, where there was very explicit policy that the only statistics that got produced were the statistics that were needed by the government of the day. There was no obligation to be transparent. There was no obligation to publish. ONS publishes everything it does, by the way. In those days, there wasn't. So to have now come to the point where we have enshrined in legislation this obligation, plus what this did, it set up an institutional framework which would ensure this would happen. So it set up the UK Statistics Authority, which Stephen mentioned, of which I am Chief Executive. I'm a civil servant. I am not accountable to any minister. Our accountability, the accountability of my department, works directly to Parliament. So we are accountable to Public Administration Select Committee, of which you may hear more, through the board of the UK Statistics Authority, chaired by Andrew Dilmott, many of you will know, and that is our statutory responsibility. It's also, the UK Statistics Authority is also the parent body for ONS. And again, part of the reason for that was to separate out the production of key official statistics away from any possible perception or temptation for ministers or others to interfere with that production process. So that's the kind of institutional arrangement. What it also did, that legislation, is it required the Statistics Authority to establish a code of practice for official statistics. That's what it looks like. It's on the web as well. What that code of practice has is an obligation on producers of all official statistics to comply with various principles and standards. The principles, I'll read out a few of them: impartiality and objectivity, integrity, confidentiality, protecting the confidentiality of the data we hold, sound methods, assured quality. They're very similar to the fundamental principles endorsed by the UN. So this is the legal manifestation of those fundamental principles in the UK. Other countries have other arrangements. The one bit of our regime where we sometimes get criticised by other countries is there was one part of this whole framework of integrity, independence, impartiality that government, or Parliament actually, this was legislation that went through Parliament, couldn't quite bring themselves to give up. And that is that in the UK, as in some other countries, but not everywhere, ministers have 24 hours access to statistics before you do. So there is a regime by which, so for example, yesterday when we published the GDP numbers, 9:30 Tuesday morning, 9:30 Monday morning, the Chancellor, key officials in the Treasury had access to those numbers. The Statistics Authority and me would like to see that disappear. Now, 24 hours is short enough that, believe me, there is no interference. I have never, ever had a phone call from the Chancellor saying, oh, I don't like these GDP numbers, can you do something with them, please? That does not happen. It's never happened. However, what it does do, of course, is that it gives chance for briefing officials and government to develop the lines to take so that they can be on the front foot when we release our figures at 9:30. And from my point of view, the risk of that, I don't want to interfere with political debate. I welcome political debate. They can debate as much as they like. But from my point of view, actually what I want is all of you to have those numbers at 9:30 when they're released available to you with our voice saying what the key messages are. And actually sometimes our voice gets drowned out by, of course, they're not going to come to me for what's the key message when they can go to a politician. But that's the only part of the regime that, as a Statistics Authority, we have said to Parliament that we wish were changed. The other part of this, which is relevant to crime, is that there is a statutory assessment process by a team that is independent of me. By law, I have no remit in terms of the assessment of statistics against the Code of Practice. So every set of official statistics gets independently reviewed to ensure that they are complying with those principles and those standards. The good news is, what do you trust, is that overwhelmingly the message is that the UK has a comprehensive set of statistics produced to high standards with integrity and impartiality using sound methods, principles and so on. There have been occasions, and police recorded crime is one of them, where the assessment process has said, we're not assured. We don't think that the evidence is there to be able to give the public assurance about the quality of those statistics. And I'll come back to more about that when I talk about crime. Going to move on. And this is that was all very well. That's the principles, that's the institutional arrangement, that's the ethics, that's what we say we do. Well, okay, how do you make sense of that? This is something about a month ago, something like that. I was invited to talk to a group, and I think there were about 70 BBC journalists, national and local, and researchers, because the new Director General the BBC, had decided that he wanted to provide training across the BBC to help journalists, broadcasters, improve the way that they reported statistical information. Fantastic. They were struggling. How can they make sense of it? An hour to write a story or to prepare something for the news or TV. How on earth do they make sense of it? So spent a day in Broadcasting House talking about how do they make sense of it. And this is in the hints and tips. The very first thing, and this is based on years of talking to people when they're confronted with some statistical information, the very first question I ask, and is the one that I'm surprised everybody doesn't ask, is, does it make sense? Is it credible? And I'm going to illustrate that with one of my examples where I got totally frustrated a few years ago. Which was about the whole debate about teenage pregnancies. I'll come back to that. So the first thing is, does it make sense? Is it credible? The second is, who produced the numbers and why? The third, and again I'll come back to this, is a number on its own often means nothing. The number only means something if you can contextualise it. So, for example, I know, Stephen mentioned my role in the census over the decades. I know that when we release census data once a decade, the first question we get asked is, this data for Jedi in Brighton, how does it compare with 10 years ago? Because being told that, whatever the number is, I can't remember it, 7% of the Brighton population say they're Jedi, means actually nothing. It begins to mean something, I suppose, if you ask, and has that gone up or down? And it might mean something if you say, and how does Brighton compare with Oxford or Cambridge or Manchester or whatever? So the context actually matters. Those are just the three top things. Let me just explore why I used to get so frustrated. This was something Mail Online, and it talks about, you get this headline. A lot of people just read the headlines. UK tops the league of teenage pregnancy. UK's sky-high teenage birth rate. Okay, got the picture. Reading it quickly, not an expert, that's the story that's conveyed. What's the truth? Few charts. Can't present without a few charts. The first is live births by age. 2012, England and Wales. Under 20s, teenagers. Proportion of all live births in that year that were to a mother under the age of 20, less than 5%. Okay? Bit of context, bit of perspective. Okay? The other thing that we also know is that most of those mothers, the father is also recorded on the birth certificate. So there's a father around somewhere. That's one way of looking at it. But actually that's just live births. One of the things that headline, that previous headline about, was actually teenage pregnancies. Pregnancy not the same as a birth. So let's look at conceptions. This is under 18-year-olds, because actually what the story is about is not teenagers, it's the younger end. Sky high. It's the lowest it has ever been, probably. If you look at conceptions per 1,000 women, which is the way it's measured, It's down to less than 30 for every 1,000 young women aged under 18. Lowest it's ever been. Significant drop. If you saw that kind of trend in other areas, you'd think, wow, something's going on here. This is a real change. It's a real trend. Particularly if I juxtaposed it with the over 18 conception rate, where the fertility rate now is almost as high as it's ever been. So for older women, it's gone completely the opposite direction. So with that context, begin to think, right, okay, is this message of sky high really, and that we've got this epidemic of teenage conceptions, right? The other thing I should say is we know that about half of those conceptions end in a birth, less than half. So we're down to just over 1% of young women giving birth. Also mentioned area comparisons. It varies. So the other thing always to do is not just take the headline, because the headline can be very misleading. It varies enormously between different parts of the country. The darker the colour, the higher the rate. For this area, you can see that actually the outliers, the darkest colours, the areas with the highest teenage conception rate are Hastings, and what surprised me, Eastbourne. Maybe this area has changed since I lived down here, but I was a bit surprised by that. But you know, if you are responsible for teenage pregnancy policy in this area, you're going to be really interested by that. Lowest in Wealdon, Brighton, Lewis in the middle. What this also shows you, again, further analysis, digging down, I'll just explain this. There is an index of deprivation which calculates on a whole range of indicators deprivation scores for every local authority in the country, and actually for smaller areas than that as well. So the most deprived local authority in the country at this end, the least deprived at that end. Conceptions per 1,000 women. And the first thing you can see is that the poorer the area, the higher the teenage conception rate. Okay, probably not too much surprise in that. What it also shows you is that Eastbourne, we went, that's a surprise. Actually, Eastbourne is, what is it, about 90 odd on the deprivation index. It's very similar in terms of teenage conception rates to other areas with the same kind of social and economic characteristics. And actually, when you look at this, it's Brighton that's the outlier. So Brighton looked in the middle. Okay, what's happening? Here, actually, Brighton has a lower teenage pregnancy rate than you would expect, taking account of all the other characteristics of the area. So whoever is responsible for teenage conceptions, pregnancy in Brighton, actually is probably thinking they're doing a pretty good job. And there are probably others who are thinking, actually, I wonder how Brighton does it. So that's just to illustrate, first of all, that it is worth digging down, it's worth asking questions, and it's worth contextualising when you read something on Mail Online, if you ever do, telling you a story about some social or economic phenomenon. Let me get to crime. And I'll tell the story of crime. Stephen referred to it in the introduction. Of course, having accurate crime statistics that everybody can trust is incredibly important. And I went to a group of people and said to them, so why does it matter? Why does it matter that we have crime statistics that are accurate and inform and trusted? And the answers you got were the same as the kind of things I've been saying. They inform levels of resources going into police and criminal justice agencies. They inform decisions about the deployment of those resources. They inform citizens about their risk of being a victim of crime. So if you're moving house and you look at Crime Mapper and data to see what's the crime in the area that you're thinking of moving to. They inform development and monitoring of policy interventions. They inform service users about the performance of the police. And they inform Parliament, the media and citizens in their exercise of democratic accountability. Same kinds of themes. In that list, all very noble, there was one big problem, which is this one about informing citizens about their risk of being a victim of crime. Because what we also know from other research is that citizens vastly overestimate their risk of being a victim of crime. They think crime is much higher and all around them. And reading, again, some of the headlines, they probably think that crime is higher than it's ever been before, none of which is true. And I'll show you some graphs. So it was for that reason, that mismatch between what the statistics were showing and people's perception of what the statistic, what was really happening. It was that led the Home Secretary to invite me to do an independent review of crime statistics with a view of building trust in those statistics. I was not an expert in crime statistics, but doing that review, it quickly became clear to me several things. First was, it's complex. It's not even clear what we mean by, what are we measuring when we talk about crime statistics? We talk about crime going up and down. What is it that we're measuring? We're certainly not measuring an awful lot of the things that citizens think of as crime. And that's for two reasons. One is that the system does not record some things, motoring offences, using your mobile on the phone while you're driving, etc. They do not get recorded. And the second is that actually there are some things that the public think of as crimes that our criminal justice system may not think of as crimes, like some of the antisocial behaviour. And when you look at some of the research that's been done, what people are saying when they say they don't know whether crime's going up or down, it's not necessarily they're disbelieving the statistics. It's that they can't make sense of them. Because actually what they think of as crime is the stuff that's going on around them. So they report things like gangs of kids hanging around on street corners. And feeling vulnerable in their own homes, even though no crime is being committed. So, first of all, first question on crimes, what are we trying to measure here? The second is, it became clear to me too, that we are very, very lucky in the UK to have a system of a world-class survey. That is a survey where we interview, not we, a survey research organisation interviews thousands of people in their own homes every year, Crime Survey for England and Wales, on their experience of crime. What have they actually experienced in crime? That survey is considered to be one of the best, if not the best, such surveys in the world, and we should cherish it. Alongside that, we have a huge tradition of the police recording crimes. So I'm going to demonstrate why those things are different. But actually, the fact that we've got two completely different systems is a strength of the UK system of crime statistics. However, it's difficult and it's complex, and it's an area where there is risk. I'll say a little bit more about that too. More headlines. What's happening to crime in the UK? Is it going up? Is it going down? Well, I don't know about you, but if I put all of that, depending on which newspaper you read, then you probably get a rather different picture. Actually, this is ours. That's what we published last week, I think it was, or maybe the week before. But there are also questions about, so what do we mean by crime? And one of the areas where we are not yet, work going on, very well to measure is cybercrime. So somebody sends you a scam email in the hope that 1 in several million will respond. Then, of course, most of us who get a lot of those, you just delete. But are you a victim of crime? Well, potentially you are. But you know, we're just not good at measuring that. But nevertheless, that is the story. This is what the crime survey shows. A peak in the mid-90s in the number of offences, and a rapid and again fairly startling and impressive decline in crime since the mid-1990s, and albeit at a slightly slower rate, a continuing decline. That's why we were able to say with confidence, with authority, that crime, as measured by the Crime Survey for England and Wales, the most authoritative way you can measure it, is going down. What does police recorded crime show us? Much longer history. They've been doing this, police have been doing this for over a century. You'd think they'd get good at it, wouldn't you, Olivia? But what's this tell us? What this tells us, several things. Bringing back into that question, does it make sense? Is it credible? What does it tell us? First of all, you would think that compared with our predecessors, we do live in an incredibly crime-ridden society. But do we really believe that crime is 4 times higher now than it was 100 years ago? I don't. It's much more likely to be an artifact of the way that we as citizens report crime. Do you bother telling the police in the first place? And what you tell them about is likely to change over time. And what the police do once you've told them. So one of the things, I think the next slide, no, I'll go back to this one. One of the things that's really interesting to us, to me, is first of all, at this more recent period, what was happening? Why was it that it looked like it was going down and then there was a sudden increase? And then what's happened since then? How do the two series compare? Do they tell the same story? Not entirely. So what do you believe? How do you make sense of it? Well, various things were happening. First of all was that, demonstrate this even better on this one. This was a chart that ONS published 18 months ago, something like that, and which led to the public controversy and the Public Administration Select Committee inquiry into all of this. And what this showed, since 1981 when the crime survey began, is that something in the early period, about 60% of the crimes that people said they reported to the police actually got recorded. Fairly steady. There was then a big increase. And that was because in the early 2000s, the Home Office introduced some new rules. And they said, this matters. Targets, all of that. We really need to know what's happening. We need to have some standards that all police forces adopt for how they record crime. We're going to train people. We're going to set rules. And suddenly, you saw a big increase. And of course, big increase in the relationship with the crime survey. That stayed fairly steady for a few years. Everybody thought, this is great. And then the relationship between the two, i.e. the police recorded crime statistics, were capturing less of the crimes that people themselves were saying that they had experienced, dropped off. So the question is, why did it drop off? And there's lots of reasons. Could be genuine. But what we also know is that around this time, 2007, the Audit Commission was abolished. And the Audit Commission had had responsibility for auditing data collected by police. I am a good statistician. I am not saying there is causality. I am noting that there was a change in what was in the regime by which police recorded crime was quality assured, an important part of our fundamental principles and the code of practice. We also know from various work that was done actually by Her Majesty's Inspector of Constabulary that there was some quite notable variations between police forces in the extent to which their recording captured the crimes that were reported to them. Now, I don't want to overstate that, and I think there is a report coming out tomorrow which will say more about that. But nevertheless, that was enough to enable the Statistics Authority, set up under statute, to look at these numbers against the code of practice and to say, we cannot, the producers of these statistics, cannot assure the public that they are being produced to a standard and consistency that means that you can draw entirely robust conclusions from them. There is something going on here that we don't fully understand. Public Administration Select Committee had a series of grillings. Stephen was called to give evidence. I was called to give evidence. Various other people were called to give evidence. And it, fairly strange process, but anyway. They too were concerned about the quality of police recorded crime. And one of the things that they called for was a much stronger audit regime of what actually happens if you report a crime to, or something that you think of as a crime, to the police. Are they applying the standards? Have they got, the people who are doing the recording, have they got sufficient training? Have they got sufficient seniority? They called on ONS, who publishes this stuff, to explain, we carry on publishing it, but to explain very, very clearly to anybody who wants to use the numbers, the caveats that there now are around them. There are no caveats around the crime survey numbers. And it called on a committee that Stephen chairs, Crime Statistics Advisory Committee, completely independent committee of experts, to take a strong role in helping develop and improve the statistics that the police produce. And a lot of thinking and a lot of work going on. But quite painful for a lot of people. Actually, I illustrate this because what I think it does do is demonstrate the strength of the system. That if you see a logo, a national statistics logo against a set of statistics, you know that they have been through this process of being assessed against the code of practice. And that's one of the ways you know whether you can trust them. The fact that these statistics no longer carry the logo doesn't mean they're useless. Doesn't mean that the police are fiddling the numbers. What it does mean is get your critical brain on again to be thinking about, and we will do our best to help and explain what really is behind that. Why are those not designated as national statistics? So, just in summing up, what are the issues? What conclusions can we draw? The first is that in order for the police to record a crime, it has to be reported to them. And an awful lot of what a lot of citizens think of as crime may not very legitimately be recorded by the police. We have to do a much better job of explaining that. What is a crime? In terms of crime statistics, we have to do a much better job at explaining that. Some things are very difficult to measure. We know that the survey, as well as the police recorded crime, are deficient in some of the ways that increasingly should be mattering to us. For example, domestic violence. And finding ways in which you can capture domestic violence to reflect them, and some other crimes, so that you can reflect them in statistics, is a measurement challenge that is still not completely addressed. It means that I would go back to where I started. If you're seeing a number, how on earth can you make sense of it? What is it that you need to do? First thing is say, does it make sense? Is it credible? Who produced it and why did they produce it? And for official statistics, does it carry that national statistics flag? Has it been quality? Has it been assured against those principles? Back to, again, where I started. I started with the picture of the UN and the fundamental principles, and I've ended up with a picture of a digger. But there is a thread going through that. And that thread is those principles. It is about integrity. It is about transparency. It is about openness. And it's about explaining some of the complexities. But it's also about all of you taking an active part in that process, because if I were you, I wouldn't leave all of that just to me. Thank you.